let you introduce yourself first here as we get going so folks know
Okay.
where we're coming from. Tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Jessica Hebenstreit. I have about 24 years of experience in the industry. I've done a little bit of everything. Tend to do a lot of security operations, incident response, that kind of stuff. My current role is I'm the senior director of corporate security for a software company. We provide software to the oil and gas industry, and I'm responsible for basically all of security at my company in that context.
Of course, I double muted, right? Awesome. I'm Jake. Jake Williams. I work with Ions. I've been here, gosh, almost, I think we're pushing 7 years now. Time flies when you're having a great time. Spent 18 years in the Intel community doing various fun offensive and defensive missions, mostly offensive there. Left that world in 2013, thought for good. And then the Russians outed me by name in 2017. So I can at least say I used to be a hacker for the National Security Agency. And beyond that, I'm going to talk too much about that because I'm too pretty for jail. But today I work as the VP of R&D for Hunter Strategy. We're a mostly or used to be traditionally defense industrial base contracting firm. We hold like the red team contracts for all the U.S. federal courts. We have a big commercial services arm now too that I help to build out, and that's a little bit about me and where I'm coming from here. Um, Today we really wanted to talk about what we're primarily getting asked about right now that you are likely to continue to be asked about in 2025.
hmm
Three of those, and then maybe another one here that's flown under the radar. And Jessica,
Yeah.
from a talking point perspective, you grabbed a few of these. Um, what were your thoughts here?
Yeah, so I mean, I think AI is going to continue to be, a hot topic. I think we're still going to get a lot of questions from our leadership on this. We're still going to get a lot of questions from our board of directors on this. The space continues to evolve as well as new models are released and new products are released. And so really understanding the impact to our organizations and how to talk to those points and with our leaders. And then I'm actually getting this next one asked of me a lot. Well,
Yeah.
you know, we have
Yeah.
NDR now. Why do we still need an internal SOC kind of question? And so I'm really excited to dive into that one with you. Some of those CrowdStrike questions are starting to die down a little bit. I think there was a heavy, oh my God, the world is on fire. We need to move
Right.
away from CrowdStrike initial reaction. I think
Mhm.
cooler heads have prevailed a little bit, but I still think there's an important conversation to have here around our service providers and resiliency and those kinds of things. And then you came up with this great one. It wasn't even on my radar, so thank you for bringing this one up. I've done a lot of research on it in the intervening weeks since we came up with our agenda. So I'm really excited to dig into this and hear from you, what your thoughts are on all this.
Yeah, you said there that the CrowdStrike questions are dying down, and I would say yes, right? But the people that are asking them, like the number of them has gone down, but the people that
Yeah.
are asking them now are instead of initially it was like just line level stakeholders and in some cases, C levels. But I'm getting board questions now, right? So
Yeah.
I'm almost catching like the second wave of that, right?
Yeah.
And then particularly for folks that were heavily impacted, what are we doing to make sure this doesn't happen again? Which, holy goodness, is that a loaded
Yeah.
question, right?
And I think
Um,
there's a tail there, right? As
Oh,
to
yeah.
why we're getting those board questions now is because, a lot of us only meet with our board maybe quarterly. And so,
Yeah.
right. So now is when, we have to report to them that we were impacted. And so now they're going, is this the right vendor for us? Right.
Right.
So I think there's a lot to dig into there.
Yeah. And secondarily, the other big question I'm getting, right, and one of the reasons I wanted to put this one in here was the obviously it was a hot topic, but lest you think it's in the past, a lot of folks are being hammered not just with the is this the right vendor, but also the even if you weren't a CrowdStrike customer, what can we do to make sure this never happens to us?
Yeah.
And the tail end of that question, to your point, right? Really is that folks are caught flat-footed, right, with the answer there, and now they're going to have to go back to the board next quarter, right, and brief the what are the answers around this, right?
Yeah.
And so I kind of view this as arming you a little bit. Yeah, the product liability directive. Oof, um, I am yet to talk to many folks that have this on their radar at all, and it's coming like a freight train, folks. So again, if this is, I hate to say, if you take like one thing away from this, make it this. But if you do business to consumer, it probably this is the big heavy hitter here. Um,
So, funny point, and we'll get into this more later, but I was talking to one of my senior managers today who's based in Europe, and I
mhm.
said, "Hey, what do you know about this? Have you heard about this?" And he's like, "What are you talking about?" Like zero
Right,
clue, right?
right. And
And he's on top of everything.
thank you. And this is so much bigger from a potential live bigger, I guess. It is, yeah, actually bigger than GDPR. I think personally, from like
Could be.
from a where you can get hit heavy, right? On this. Granted that the fines aren't as large, but there's a personal right of action, right? And that's a
Mhm.
big change, right? When individuals can come and start. Anyway, we'll get into that later. But to
Yeah.
your point, even folks in the EU just do not have this on their radar somehow. And
hmm
yikes. Well, let's start with AI and ROI, right?
Yeah.
I know you get hit with this all the time. I do a lot of AI work. I don't want to poison the well. Um, Let me ask you one of the big key questions here. What characteristics do you think make a good use case for AI and security ops?
Yeah. So, great question. And I spent some time thinking about this this morning just to kind of confirm what I was thinking about. And I think one of the defining characteristics is having a lot of data that you need to do something with, right? Is it improving our phishing detection and response and blocking and those kinds of things, or is it making sense of all the vulnerability management data we have and prioritizing quickly based on certain characteristics and that kind of thing. So one of the defining characteristics for me is having a large amount of data that you're needing to do something with, and it taking too much time to try and do that manually.
That's interesting, right? So that's a really interesting point because data, it's not just the size of data, it's cleanliness of data too,
Yeah.
right? So how normalized is the data versus how noisy is it?
hmm
Um, I guess for me, I kind of a step back here, and I may take a little bit different view on this. I, I've been describing, folks say, "How do I use AI?" I'm like, you're thinking about AI as a tool. AI is a
Right.
platform, right? It's a platform on which you build tools. It's
hmm
almost like saying, "How would I use AWS to, help my security infrastructure?" And it's like, it's a big question, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
I kind of I take the approach of when a client comes to me and says, "Hey, would this be a good use case?" I try and take them back a couple of meta steps, and I ask, well, is there a clearly defined place, right? Because AI is not magic. It's not like you apply it and bam, all the problems are solved. I already have to be thinking through a process, right? And then
hmm
AI is helping to automate chunks of that process,
So that's a
right?
good point, right? So anytime we have a use case for automation, right, we have to have that process clearly defined
Yes.
already and know what's going to happen when, and not
Mhm.
try and create it at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly it, right? Most of the use cases that I've dealt with, I say use cases, most of the challenges that I've dealt with where folks
hmm
are finding that they're not getting expected ROI from AI projects. It's forgive the term here. I know you're familiar with this, the underpants gnomes problem.
Yes.
Everybody's familiar with the meme, I'm sure, where it's like phase one, something, phase two, question mark, phase three, profit.
Yeah.
And folks have not figured out what the phase two is. And it's a process problem. AI is going to help you maybe automate pieces, tedious pieces, right, of
hmm
processes, but it's not going to invent the process for you, right?
Right.
And that's where I try to get folks out of the underpants and walk me through what is phase two, 2A, 2B,
Yeah.
2C. So yeah. Um,
Yeah. And one thing that I just have to say, I hate it when people ask me about ROI on security and security operations,
Thank you.
unless you're a security company, right? But for most of us, that it's a nearly impossible question to answer. And I really just, it makes me cringe when I see ROI in context of like, especially like security operations and stuff.
Yeah, I'm with you there, right? And the other thing that I keep trying to drive home to folks too is, and I've helped several clients at this point, including Ions, right, build out AI applications, right. But again, I want to be very clear here: AI is a platform on which you build applications. By the way, the behemoth behind me, or Colossus, technically, is the big machine learning workstation there with half a terabyte of RAM and high end GPUs. And but again, I love this stuff, but at the end of the day, we've got to have a problem first. We have to figure out
Mhm.
what that problem is and define it, right? Um,
We're at
I,
that phase of the hype cycle, right? Where
thank you.
AI can solve everything, right?
Right?
And I think in 2025, probably towards the latter half, we'll start getting into that trough of disillusionment of AI
Yes.
sucks, it's terrible, what were we ever thinking? And then we'll start to normalize.
Yeah. Well, we're already seeing that, right?
Mhm.
We're already seeing. I think we one of our own internal surveys said that something like, I want to say, was it 18 some odd 20% of CFOs plan to cut AI projects in the next quarter or 2 quarters
Yeah,
because they weren't showing that ROI. And this is another spot where I kind of challenge that, because we were so far in to the left, that early adopter cycle, right?
right,
That you know eh, we're learning what best practices are for identifying even a problem scope here. So it's early for me to be cutting and running. And at the same time, for a lot of projects, that's exactly what you need to do, because it was ill thought out in the first place,
right.
particularly because of non-determinism. And do you want to speak at all to that, or?
Yeah, so I actually I always forget what exactly non-determinism is because I don't do this AI stuff day
Yeah.
in and day out, right? So I actually went into ChatGPT the other day and I said, "Explain to me what non-determinism is as though I'm a brain dead manager."
Yeah.
Right? Like just make it super dumb for me. Um and it basically said that there isn't like this algorithm specifically or a recipe or a step-by-step process of how an answer is derived, right?
Right.
Just like if I'm analyst one and I look at a particular ticket, I may come to the same conclusion as analyst two, but my route to get there will be different, right?
Hmm.
Or could be different. And so basically that non-determinism, and tell me where I'm off because you're way smarter on this than I am. But this non-determinism is you may ask the same question two, three, four, 5 times, you might get a slightly different answer. How the answer is derived may be slightly
Yeah.
different every time because the model continues to learn, it takes in new information, that
Mhm.
kind of thing. So
Yeah. No.
I did that right?
Yeah, no, you're right on there, right? So
Yeah.
the thing I want to highlight here is that the you can ask the same question repeatedly and get not just slightly different answers, but wildly different
Yeah.
answers, right? One of the things that one of the common security use cases I hear people talk about is saying data classification. Well, okay, we ran internally at Ions for reasons, ran some data classification experiments earlier this year. I ran for Ions some data classification experiments earlier this year. While I can't make all the results of those public, I can tell you that asking asking the same AI model hundreds of times to classify and give a confidence score for, is this information in this, is this data, right, that we're passing in this particular class, we went from 0 to 100%, right? Ranged from 0 to 100% across a couple hundred, several hundred instances. And you see stuff like that, and then you go, wow, okay, well, now what are my failure cases, right? Because
Mhm.
yikes, right? Because now, granted, most of them, right, if we plant these on a number line, right, most of them bracket in, to cluster in together. But man, it's you know, if I can't tolerate the single wrong answer, right, of zero
Right.
percent or the single wrong of 100%, this is probably not a good use case for me.
And if you think of that in the context of security operations, right? So if I get the zero answer and it's actually ransomware and now my entire environment is just decimated because it got the answer wrong initially, right? I mean, eventually other controls are going to pop in and you're going to be like, "Oh crap," right?
Yeah.
Or you're wasting a lot of time because you got 100% of like, "Yes, this is super bad." You're totally screwed and you're spending all this time to find out that, oh no, it was actually wrong. Like what could that time have been spent on otherwise, right?
Right.
So it's
Yeah.
it's that problem of how much do you trust it? And can those
Yeah.
edge cases, really be impactful?
Yeah. So we definitely need to move on, but before we do, I want to get one more thought in here from you. Copilot for security, where do you sit?
Not ready for prime time.
Not ready for that's exactly my so my testing experience with Copilot for security has been that, and it's not, this is not a knock on Microsoft.
Mm-mm.
It is a question of, is it making recommendations that are consistently in line with what my, and again, fairly high tier SOC analysts are going to do. Now I do want to note here, not ready for prime time is my assessment as well. But the clients that I service at Hunter, right, with our MSSP, you know, can't accept those failure cases, right? If you have a SOC that's, forgive me, right, is bargain basement, right? You are
Yeah.
well below market rates, and your SOC is, let's call it, below average. Copilot for security probably is a plus up, to be honest, right? So a lot depends on where where
The
your starting
maturity,
line is
right?
at.
Maturity, are
Yeah,
you below the security
that's it.
poverty line? Those kinds of things, right?
Yeah, yeah. So there's value here for some. Again, the big key is you got to do your own testing here, and yeah. So okay, let's drive on here. I know we've got questions in the chat. We've also got 600 plus of you online. So apologies here. A couple other things to cover. We'll circle back to questions at the end as we have time. Jessica, this is one of yours. I want to give it to you here first. Evolving role of the SOC. What do you think? SOC versus MDR.
Yeah. So I look at MDR as a complement to my team. I
Mhm,
don't see it as an ability to completely replace that talent internally. So we're looking at a hybrid model,
mhm,
right? Now, you're probably going to get pressure from executive leaders, the
mhm,
board. It feels like we're paying for dual kind of responsibilities and roles and those kinds of things. And so your job is going to be to explain that, no, not really, right?
mhm.
The
Well,
best MDR provider in the world, one second, the best
no,
MDR
please.
provider in the world isn't going to have the nuanced business context and knowledge, business acumen of my environment that my internal SOC analysts are going to have, right? And so it's finding that balance of what is the MDR able to do for us, right? Offload some of that work for
Mhm,
us. And maybe my SOC can work on other projects, engineering stuff, all of that kind of thing, right? But I don't think you can like get rid of your SOC because you have an awesome MDR provider, as much as some of us would love to.
Well, you are starting to answer the question that I was getting ready to ask you,
Okay.
because you said, hey, it's a hard sell. You're probably gonna have to go justify. And my you started to touch on it, but for those in the audience, in case we have folks that don't read between the lines here, when you're asked, why am I paying for the MDR and the SOC? What's your justification for keeping your SOC employees?
So I'll talk about them having, being with the company for a long time, having that nuanced, sometimes institutional knowledge
Yeah.
that isn't documented anywhere, right? They're going to have more loyalty to my company and care about the company, probably, in
Mhm.
most cases, than, I'm just a customer, and your MDR providers will be like, oh, we love our customers. We're going to treat you just like our own, blah, 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 blah. Okay. And even, I mean, there are some really great MDR providers out there
Mhm.
that it feels like a really good partnership and an extension of your team.
Yeah.
They're still not your company, right? At the end of the
Yeah.
day,
Yeah.
they're their own company. So those are the kinds of arguments that I would start making.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there, right? For me, it's that is exactly the argument that I go back and make. Look, I think we hire top tier MSSP analysts. I'm sure everybody says that, or an MDR analyst. But I will also confess that we don't have the internal knowledge that you do.
Right.
When somebody comes and says, "Hey, what can I use my SOC analysts for? How can I retrain? How can I reapply those people with really valuable institutional knowledge?" I usually turn, and I mentioned your thought on this, retrain them into threat hunt, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
context matters so much more.
Mm-hmm.
Retrain them in some cases into CTI, and then also being the escalation point, right?
The
Um,
escalation point. I also think detection engineering support, right?
yeah,
Like getting
yeah.
those nuanced detections for your environment instead of just what's kind of fresh out of the box.
Yeah. Well, let's also note here there are a lot of MDR providers. I might say the majority of MDR providers that will answer alarms for their detections, but will
Right.
not answer alarms for your detections.
Hmm.
Unless you think that that's great and that's going to be perfect, because their detections definitely have you covered. Schedule some purple team time with me. I will show you categorically that they do not. Right.
Yeah.
So
Because
let
they
me then
have to
ask you
have that
this.
lowest common denominator, right?
Right.
Because they can't possibly have all of these unique detections. I mean, it breaks the business model. Why they can't exist like that. They have to
Well,
have a pretty standardized product that they're
mhm.
deploying to you.
Yeah. Well, one of the examples I use all the time is PS Exec, right? It's my
Yep.
go-to example. If I know that you have Manage Engine installed everywhere, and I'm just picking a straw man here, um, you should not be using PS Exec in your network, right? If you are, we probably have a problem, right? Uh,
Hmm.
that's probably a threat actor. But I can't, as an MDR, possibly create an alarm on PS Exec because across all of my clients, not everybody has a management framework, right?
Right.
And even those that do, some of them have a Bob who can't be corralled in and is going to use PS Exec till the day he dies. And,
Why are
and,
you
and
picking
that's,
on Bob?
yeah, I know, right? But then we just got it's alarm mania, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, there's so much you can do internally with your own SOC. Don't listen, any of you who are an IONS client, before you let somebody wrestle the sock away from you because you have an MDR subscription, schedule an AAE with me or Jessica or AJ King or Wolf or any number of the folks that have built
Yeah.
and run security ops centers and can help you speak the business language, right, as well,
Yep.
to keep that in house, right?
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
yeah.
There's so much your SOC can do if you can offload some of that work, right? Like that's the
Oh
benefit of
yeah.
the MDR is that they can offload some of that work so that your internal folks can work on the more interesting, the more nuanced,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
By the way, too, what a fantastic, just to close out with another pointer, what a fantastic way to increase retention. Because the work
Hmm.
that the MDR folks do, I'm not, please, if you're a SOC analyst, don't let me, imply that that work is boring. It is very impactful. It is, for me, not fun. I want to go to detection engineering. I want to dive into the hard cases. And so MDR frees me up to do more of that.
Yep. And it's a
Um,
great place to start your career, right? I mean,
Bingo.
you you can't go and do some of those more
Mhm.
advanced things if you haven't spent your time kind of doing some of that SOC analyst stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. One more question here I'm going to ask you. Do you outsource other services too? Because I hear some folks kind of asking about that. We've outsourced MDR. Do we outsource CTI? Do we outsource threat hunting? Where do you sit on those?
It depends. My favorite security answer, right? Um, I think largely those need to be internal activities.
Mhm,
Um, because again, you need that nuanced knowledge of the environment. I
mhm,
think you can outsource things like help with your vulnerability management
mhm.
and those kinds of things. But when it comes to like threat hunting and CTI, I really feel like that's got to be it would take a strong argument to convince me that it doesn't belong internal.
Yeah. So I may have a differing opinion here. This is why I was interested in your take. We have not rehearsed this,
Yeah.
obviously, but so I I kind of sit on the fence here, right? Where I'm going to use the Copilot analogy, security for Copilot analogy again. If you're going down market for your CTI analysts, right? If you are grabbing somebody who has no formal intelligence training, and like read a book about CTI, you probably are getting better, with a competent outsourced
Mm.
provider,
That's a
right?
good a point. Yes.
Yeah, I think, but to your point, right? If we're talking about a top tier, like you're investing in this as a program, yeah,
Yes.
100%, right? But again, now we're back to that's going to cost infinitely more.
And the
Uh,
maturity
oh
and
yeah,
right. Yeah.
yeah.
Can your
Well, and
security program support that?
I mean, you and I both. Heck, me and Jessica met actually standing up a security program at a multi-billion-dollar, healthcare organization, and
Hmm.
I remember some of the challenges we had with our CTI program and deriving value from it.
Yeah.
It was I mean, they were all predictable problems. They were things we knew we were going to have growing quickly like that. But it's not easy. And if you haven't been through it, right, CTI tends to be in my experience, right, without some guiding force behind the wheel, there tends to be
Yeah.
a budget suck, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we threw a lot of money and resources at that, looking back, hindsight 2020, all of that kind of stuff, probably could have been better spent in other areas.
Yeah, I mean, there though, let's be fair, right? We were told we were building a
Yeah, yeah,
CTI
yeah. Of
capability
course. Yeah.
day one,
Yeah.
despite our objections to say
Yeah.
like this is a month 12 thing, not a month one
Right.
thing. But
Yeah.
but we would have been
Cool.
better
You're doing a
served.
month one.
Yeah. We would have been
Yeah.
better, far better served sourcing for the first 6 months to a year, or what have you,
Yeah.
than reevaluating that, right? And then bringing on that headcount when we were ready in the rest of our
Yeah.
overall program maturity. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. Agreed.
So, CrowdStrike 2.0. Right? Is this something that we can even prevent? And if so, how many resources do you put towards trying to prevent this versus everything else you have going on in your security program?
So I also want to throw a little wrench in this a little bit as well.
Hmm.
It's not just CrowdStrike. So I mean, I know there's been a couple recent news items about logs being lost, right?
Well,
Cloudflare lost some logs for what, like 3.5 hours
mhm,
for a lot of customers. A couple weeks or a month before that, Microsoft had an outage where they lost some logs because of some change that trickled down throughout the environment with their log aggregation that caused a problem. And so this isn't just a CrowdStrike or just an EDR problem, right? I think we need
mhm,
to frame this as to how we think about resiliency in these fundamental needed tools that are in our environment and how much we're
mhm,
relying on third parties, right? And I don't think we should have a knee jerk like, oh, we need to bring it all back in house. We need to have these massive data lakes and all that kind of stuff. I don't think that's the answer either. But I do think we have to have the conversation with the business of these are our key providers. These are the impacts of, an outage or, something like that. And we need to practice and tabletop what are we going to do in those situations when that inevitably does happen because it's going to
mhm.
happen.
Yeah,
What do you think?
I'm with you. I think this is a pure play resilience problem, right? I did the IONS, whatever we're calling it, like right now tech briefing. The day after that happened, I was in literally sitting on the floor in the Vegas airport,
Hmm.
in a corner, trying to avoid the noise and talk through this. And it's a resiliency problem. By the way, I did not get out that day because I was on Delta and
I
nothing got out.
recall.
Yeah, yeah, no, I was shutting you up, and sure enough, yeah. So, but yes. But it is. I'll say again now, and I say this to folks, even today, right? This is really a risk that we had all accepted, whether we realized it or not,
Right.
right? And so, but it is all about resiliency. And I year before last, right? Splunk's big conference, their shirt of the year was "You had me at resilience," and I loved it. I was like, yes, that's the message, or part of the
Yeah.
big message we need to be sending in security, because I remember old school days, right? CIA triad, right? That's the availability piece, right? And
Hmm.
there's so much more to that though, because you talked about other platforms like losing logs. Well, that's an availability of our monitoring, right?
Right.
We've had multiple issues with Microsoft 365 and Entra ID, and Salesforce, and I can just count, keep the list going on and on and on and on. And that
Hmm.
doesn't mean you pull it back in house. I mean, heck, you'd be negligent to bring your email back in house out of Microsoft 365, because Microsoft's just not investing in Exchange, right?
Right.
But so okay, so clearly the message is no knee jerk. This is a big resiliency problem.
Hmm.
What tactically do you tell a board member who's breathing down your neck, like, well, then what are we doing about resiliency?
Right. So that's a great question. I think that one, we have to do an analysis of
Mhm,
where these failure points are.
mhm,
What's the impact of it occurring, right? Of
mhm,
having an actualized, risk, and then practicing what our response would be, right? Do we just accept that we don't have email for 3 hours? Do we, or in the case of CrowdStrike, where it was complete meltdown, blue screen of death, manual intervention on thousands of machines potentially, you
Mhm.
know, we need to have a plan in place so that we can start executing on that as quickly as possible. Do we have, recovery keys available, or are they lost on someone's, OneDrive or computer, that they can't get to? And
Mhm.
how are we going to go about this? I think it goes back to, I mean, it's disaster recovery and business continuity. How are we going to recover from this and tabletop out and practice some of these things so that we have that muscle memory to go execute quickly on those plans?
Yeah, I think that's it, right? For me, I just literally use two words here when somebody asks me on this. It's contingency planning, right?
Yeah,
We're investing in business continuity, right? And by business continuity, I don't mean we're going out and buying redundancies of everything. I'm
right.
doing that dependency mapping, and then I'm working through and saying, okay, well, what failure scenarios, as we throw it at the wall to see what sticks, what failure scenarios can we gracefully make our way through, and what can't we?
Hmm.
And I employ a methodology that I learned in the intelligence community, and it's if basically if you need something, on a particular op, like as you're practicing it in the warehouse, if it comes inside the tape, it goes with you in the field. Period. Even if you didn't think you needed it, and I kind of do the same thing here, right?
Hmm.
If I'm saying, oh well, then we'll email everyone, right? Using what? An email distribution list. Oh, okay. What happens when Microsoft 365 goes down? What happens when
Right.
CrowdStrike, we don't allow BYOD, and CrowdStrike has taken out our PCs? How do I communicate with the employee? And then
Hmm.
immediately that starts backing up to, oh, well, now we need phones. Okay, well, where are the phone call, the phone trees at? Are they
Right.
printed? Right? Like this is that you start working back from that. And it really does come down to just that pre-planning and, to your point, tabletop, tabletop, tabletop. I
Hmm.
I do a lot of tabletops for clients, and it is probably the highest ROI activity that you can do is have good tabletops, good, well put together scenario tabletops with your teams.
Not just check the
Mhm.
box compliance
Oh,
activities for your SOC too.
yeah. Well, we've all done those too, right? So yeah, yeah.
Right.
Um, so I'm going to ask you another hard question here that we haven't rehearsed. What do you think about log scale? I'm getting a lot of questions about this.
I don't know a lot about it, to be
Mhm.
honest. It's just recently come on my
Mhm.
radar. I do have, I believe it's somewhat new this year.
Mhm.
I hear a lot about Sentinel, and I almost said Sentinel One. That's the wrong product. Um, too many similar names in security. I hear a lot about Chronicle still, those kinds of
Mhm.
things. I don't know a lot about log scale. I will say, I like CrowdStrike. I think they
Yeah.
do good work. I like their EDR. I think there's some benefit of, marrying those things together.
Mhm.
So I don't have anything bad to say necessarily, but I don't have a lot of experience with it yet.
Yeah. But my only experience on it really has been really has been the fact that, one, it's just not as flexible from a detection engineering standpoint
Mm.
as Chronicle. Nothing else is. Actually, I guess Google SecOps, excuse me. It'll always be Chronicle in my mind.
Oh,
But
yeah. Sorry.
yeah.
Yeah.
All good. I said it too immediately. Um, but it's not as flexible with detection engineering. Nothing else is, when it comes to Chronicle. But it's still missing some data analysis paradigms, or correlation paradigms that I
Mm.
think about with Splunk. So I look at it as not a direct Splunk replacement. My other big concern, right, is that I've already observed a couple of folks moving to it, um, having issues where they have stuff that doesn't have a CrowdStrike agent on it for any number of. By the way, that population has gone up dramatically since the CrowdStrike
Of course. Right.
snafu, right?
Right.
And now they're not collecting logs. And it's not that you can't, right? It's just that's the primary method by which you collect logs is through
Mm.
Falcon, right? The Falcon
Right.
agent. And so I I don't have a good like yay or nay. I will say if you're a giant, Fortune 100, wait. Every SIM on the market has scalability problems sometime,
Oh,
and I've already seen them here. If you're outside of the Fortune 200, you probably are not in that scalability space, there. So
Do you think this is it's still a new platform growing pains type thing, or do you think this is going to kind of continue to be an issue?
I don't. That's a great question. I'm not sure, right? Because
Hmm.
I think well, two things, right? I think it's very clear CrowdStrike's revenue is down this year relative to what they expected.
Right.
And also their development efforts, let's just kindly say, were refocused this summer.
Weird.
I know. What are the odds? Um, and so I think that the combination of those two things, gives me like a little bit more pause and log scale than I probably would have had otherwise.
Hmm.
And so I mean, look, CrowdStrike's a business. They obviously want to capitalize on the synergistic piece of the market.
Yeah.
Sentinel One is doing something similar with what they're calling Purple AI. That is way, way less mature than even log scale. And I have all
And
kinds of
even
yeah.
if you look
So
at Defender for Endpoint with Sentinel, right? I mean,
eh,
a little bit. We're having some of the
yeah.
the EDR providers are trying to move into this space, and of course, if you're in one homogeneous ecosystem, of course it's going to work
Yeah,
better, right?
it's a platform play.
Yeah,
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 yeah. I mean, I again, I think it's a good product. I have some wariness, for the long term, right? So,
yeah.
again, I don't, I certainly would not be ripping out another SEM unless it's QRadar, and replacing.
Nobody's ripping QRadar.
Oh, well, I mean, the QRadar is sold to Palo Alto. Palo
Yeah, I
Alto.
know.
Let's be very clear about it. If you are a QRadar customer, let's just be very clear here. Palo did not buy QRadar for the technology. They bought it for the customer list. You are
Yeah,
going to get Cortex Data Lake shoved down your throat, and it's coming. Whether they said it, no, no, we definitely won't do that.
yeah.
Oh, it's
Okay.
definitely coming, right? QRadar is dead, right? It's
Yeah.
all but dead. Anyway, um, let's hop over to the product liability directive so we can get wrapped up, talk about that, and then wrap up a
Hmm.
little bit.
Hmm.
Do you want to start on this? Do you want me to start on it? Where do you want to be?
So I would love to ask you some questions about it. So
Fire, do it.
can you give us a TLDR of what the heck this thing even is?
Yeah, yeah. So the product liability directive is basically a change to the way the EU Commission views liability for products, right? So traditionally, nobody reads the shrink wrap, but the agreement that you agree to says that by using a product or service, that you are, basically waiving all liability. Dot dot dot. This removes the ability for you to do that for business to consumer, business to business, no changes, right? For
Hmm.
B2C, 100%, right? You are definitely there. And by the way, even if you don't sell directly to the EU, they wrote this very, very well. So whoever is importing or reselling inside of the EU, that's the neck that they're going to go choke, right? And so yeah, right. So if you have a reseller, like there's no way around this, right? You are
Yeah.
going to be if you have B2C products at all. Yeah, it's yeah. And it applies to all software updates, right? So it's firmware within smart products, it's SaaS. SaaS is explicitly in scope. AI models are explicitly in scope. And one thing that's really, really key here. By the way, I'm not a lawyer. None of this is legal advice. Jessica's not a lawyer either, to my
I am
knowledge.
not a lawyer.
Yeah,
Nope.
okay, there you
Nope.
go. Talk to yours. But it is really important that you understand that the liability directive creates what's called a presumption of defectiveness. And so, what this means in layman's terms is that you don't need to prove that the product actually was defective and prove that defect caused harm. It just has to be a reasonable conclusion, right? And so the way that they basically are wording this, they're like, hey, there's lots of cases where, you know, folks are going to try and hide behind manufacturers and try to hide behind, oh, look at how complex this technology is. And we're the only ones in the world that could demonstrate that it truly is defective. And they're like, yeah, okay, cool, then prove it's not. Whoa, that is a completely different space, right?
Where's the
Right?
negative?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, now on that end, right? And I think it's important we kind of tap over here, right?
Yeah.
One, to note that SaaS is explicitly here, right? Again, you are covered whether you're, intentionally selling to the EU or not. but I want to note why I thought this is a big deal to bring up for security, because there is
Hmm.
one and only one affirmative defense that you can bring in the EU Commission, right? Or, yeah, sorry, the EU, in EU member states, right? And that is that you used, and these are not my words, they are the words written into the directive, that if you employed at the time of release state of the art security testing methodologies,
What does that even mean?
good luck with that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a tough space, right? But if you employed those and you can demonstrate that you employed those, right? Then and documented it, and you can show that, then you're not basically you basically are off the hook for any harm. Of course, state of the art's a constantly moving target, right? Every
Well, but
black
also,
hat. Oh, go ahead,
what is
please. Yeah.
what is state of the art, right? Because um, you know, a lot of times you'll see language of industry best practice, which is also
Yep.
really hard to baseline, right? So it's beyond that, right? Given the language, what does that mean? What
I,
is doing, SCA and SAST and DAST enough?
no,
Is it? Well, I know that,
that
but
can't be state of the art,
no. But
right?
so what's state of the art here? I mean,
I the
like today, if we had to say this was state of the art, December 11th, 2024, what would that
yeah.
look like?
I think it depends on the product we're talking about, but let's just say it's a SaaS application with, with a web app, right?
Hmm.
All have done, API security testing, including,
Yep.
and obviously website testing, including IAST,
Yep.
definitely IAST, right? I don't know from a back end perspective, right? Like I always like to run SE Linux and or AppArmor, right? Depending on my flavor of Linux. But is that required for state of the art protection? I don't
Hmm.
know, right? And that's these are questions that obviously they're gonna shake out a little bit here. But
Yeah.
my big thing that I'm thinking about is right, like the example I used yesterday on the exec comms brief was until somebody at Black Hat rolled in and gave a talk on use after free vulnerabilities and how to go exploit those
Yeah.
and gain code execution. We didn't have testing frameworks for those, right?
Hmm.
And literally on one fine day in Las Vegas, right, state of the art changed.
Yeah.
And from that day forward, state of the art, or that day, maybe it's when the first testing framework becomes available. I don't know, right? Um,
Mm.
but but state of the art is going to be a moving target. Speaking of Black Hat Europe is happening in London as we speak. Well, maybe not with the time difference, but you get the point, right?
Yeah.
This is stuff that I mean, for folks that are trying to shield themselves from liability, my big thing I'm seeing here, my crystal ball is security is going to become much more involved in the product because there's a
Hmm.
financial reason for them to be.
Do you think this is going to lead? I know it's B2C right now, but do you think this is going to lead into B2B?
I do not. The
Okay.
way I read it was the way I read. I've read the whole 60 some 59, 60 some odd pages of front material of the PLD, and the language that they use in it makes it pretty clear. It's like we're here to protect consumers,
Okay.
right? Businesses have lawyers, right, and their legal teams
Yeah.
redline contracts. A theme that comes up again and again, even in the final text, not just the notes, but even the final text. There's a theme of forcing users into legal terms that they themselves don't understand. And I,
Gotcha.
I kind of step back and think business, you don't have that excuse because you have
Right.
lawyers, right?
Right. Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
The big key here, folks, is that this went live a couple of days ago, and member states have to adopt it into their laws by December 9th, 2026. Do not think you have 2 years from today, right? If an EU member state goes off the rails and somehow adopts this into their laws next week, it's on the books, right?
Yeah.
Again, I'm not a lawyer. This isn't legal advice, but this is something to take back to your folks if you do B2C at all, right? And just say, hey, like this is coming, and it's coming like a freight train, and yeah, um,
So there's a really good question in the Q&A.
mhm.
How does EU, the PLD, and NIS2 correlate? And so this is a rabbit hole I started going down as well, because I am still trying to educate myself on NIS2 and that behemoth and what's going on there. So do you see correlations here?
I think So, right, in the sense, for explicitly in the product liability directive, if you are not complying with some other law, some other regulation,
Mhm.
involving cybersecurity or AI, you are de facto defective, right? So, like that, they're just very clear about that, right? If you're not in full compliance, right, with other regulations in the EU involving cybersecurity, so I think that's where the tie-in is,
Okay.
right?
Yeah, that makes
So
sense.
I don't think this is a replacement for NIST 2, right? I think if you're not following I guess I would kind of note here, if you're not, in compliance with NIST 2, then there's no way that you possibly could be shielded from this,
From
right?
PLD, yeah,
Yeah.
unless you're B2B.
Well, again, that's a whole separate
Right.
situation, right? So yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
okay.
But again, time's not on your side, right? You need funding
Mhm.
at a time. You need first, folks have to become aware of this, and that's your job today is to take this back to them and say, hey, got it. By the way, for Ian's clients, there's a write up on this in the portal. There's, we've been on this for it. The initial draft got pushed out in October. We've been on it since then, right?
Mhm.
But also be aware, right? This is, again, it just has not gotten a lot of traction as we talked about, and so
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Um,
Yeah, it wasn't even on my radar
yeah.
as something to until you brought it up as like, "Hey, I really think we should talk about this." And I was like,
Yeah.
"Yes, we absolutely should."
Hey,
Yeah.
based on the number of questions we're getting in the chat, I think
Yeah.
they concur.
Yeah.
So wrapping it up, what are your takeaways?
Takeaways are you're still gonna need a sock.
Yep.
uh, Resiliency and tabletopping through those resiliency kind of use cases is going to be really important. IANS can help with that through consulting engagements
Yep.
and AAEs, written AAEs, that kind of thing. And that, if you need help having that conversation of why a SOC is still needed, if you have an MDR, like Jake said, reach out. There's plenty of faculty that can help talk to that. Also, we're still going to see the AI stuff. You can't ignore it. Get your talking points ready. Look at how it might be used in your environment, but know of some of the pitfalls there to be aware of as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll close here very quickly on the AI side before we get into questions. Just I think that's the big one for me. Is you can't say no, we're not doing AI, right? Just
Yeah.
stop that. That's dumb. First off, you've been doing lots of AI without realizing it. Now,
Hmm.
generative AI is usually where people really mean here, but you're also not going to not do generative AI, right? And
Right.
so really it's about defining use cases, right? And if you're not on top of that, right, on top of being ready to go define those use cases, then it's going to be really it's going to be tough, right, to have adult conversations about this. And again, same deal. If you need help structuring those conversations, spitballing an idea, what have you, get on the phone with an Ask an Expert, one of the IANS faculty through the Ask an Expert service.
Hmm.
So yeah. Oh, hey, we've got a question that came in last minute here. All right. Asking for a coworker, which part of the cybersecurity framework do you think AI can enhance the most? Govern identity, protect, detect, respond, or recover?
Ooh, I think. Oh,
It's tough, isn't it?
yeah. Um, I'm going to say detect.
Yeah, so I think traditional AI models, right? So here I'm thinking machine really, let's be clear, machine learning, right? In the vast majority of
Yeah.
cases, models. Um, I think they're probably best in the detect side.
Hmm.
Where I see generative AI making the biggest difference is respond. Um, you know,
Yeah.
we have our own in-house inference models that we use, right, for data protection concerns and what have you. But we use those to go and have our SOC analysts, right, use those to go generate response ideas, right?
Yeah.
And so and I won't say that they're always on target, right? But they're always worth thinking about, right? It's almost like you go into a meeting, right, and you've got a bunch of people brainstorming stuff, and some of the brainstorm ideas are like that's a little out there, right?
Yeah.
But good leaders, right, come back and justify why they think it's out there, mentally go through that exercise, and
Right.
I think that's a great spot is on the response side. I think for generative AI, that's going to be one of the biggest places it
Hmm.
can help because otherwise it's really easy to get stuck in the rut of this is what I did last time, therefore I'm going to do it this time, even though the situation
Yes.
might not justify that.
I mean, I had a leader once say to me, and I think it's really, really sage advice, is you have to look at these things with fresh eyes every time you see it. You can't get stuck in that. I've already seen this 100 times. It's nothing this time as well, right? And as
Yeah.
humans, it's really hard for us to try and look at it with those fresh eyes all the time. So I think it's similar.
Yeah, I see another note in here in the chat here too, and I don't want to call out anybody by name, but like it says, I'm going to go with Discover due to LLM's ability to see patterns that we can't. That's a really bad use case for a large language model. There are lots of great machine learning models for that. LLMs are the wrong tool for that job, right? And this is another, by the way, maybe a great closing point, right, around AI is just that we consistently have that issue, right, where because large language models are the new hotness. And to be very clear, they are the one AI type of tool that lay people can use, right? You
Hmm.
don't need a mathematical background, you need a programming background. You can just interact with it, interface with it.
Hmm.
A lot of folks are swinging that around like a hammer in a China store with predictable results. Right? So, yeah.
I do like Jeff's point of using it with govern for to help with policy and standard
Yes,
development. I think that's also an excellent use case. Um,
fantastic.
yeah, yeah. So
Yeah,
I think that's also a really great place to use some of the generative AI
yeah,
or LLMs and stuff.
absolutely.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. There's one other question up here I wanted to hit real quick because we've got the time, barely, but we've got the time. What size threshold should a company create a SOC in house? 500 employees, 1,000? Those are the numbers in the chat. What's your number, Jessica?
I don't think you can do it based on employees. Um,
Right.
and I know that's the tendency that your executive leaders and your board are going to be like, oh, we've crossed this whatever threshold, do we need an internal soc now? I don't think that is the right way to measure whether or not you need a soc. Certainly when you're smaller and you're less mature and you're a one person shop, y- yeah, I mean you can't justify it, right? You're just trying to do your best. But there does come a point, and it's not necessarily employee count that
Right.
drives this, of when you need a soc.
Yeah,
What do you think?
no, I couldn't agree with you more there. I think that's exactly it, right? Is that we have to look at risk, right? And where I, I always frame it back to folks as what are the risk levels you're ready to accept, right?
Mhm.
Because we can very quickly in an afternoon or on an AE call for that matter go through and walk you through where you have holes with just an outsourced MDR, right?
Yeah.
Are those risk levels that you're ready to accept? And if the answer is yes, then you don't need a sock. And if the answer is no, then you need a sock. And for me, it's just that easy, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of that has less to do with your employees than because we work with some financial firms, right, that are like
Hmm.
500 employees but have like $20 billion under management. Well,
Right.
pretty high risk. I think you need a
Yeah.
sock, regardless of employee count.
Highly regulated and those kinds of things,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's not a like, oh, you've got your 501st employee, you now need a sock, right?
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
Yeah.